afternoon. By way of very brief additional background, besides being an author, I'm also archivist at Christ Church in Newton, or Newtown, as it was called back in the time that we'll be talking about today. And our archives go back to the founding of the church in 1769, and they were of great value in the course of writing this biography of the first rector of Christ Church, Newton. The topic today is Uzal Ogden and the American Revolution. Now, you all know what the American Revolution was, but who was Uzal Ogden, and what was his connection with the American Revolution? Even among historians, the Reverend Uzal Ogden Jr. is chiefly remembered for what he did not do, rather than what he did do, which will be our focus here today. To quote one encyclopedia, in 1798, when he was rector of Trinity Church, Newark, Ogden was elected Bishop of New Jersey, but consecration was refused by the General Convention of the Episcopal Church in June 1799, owing to difficulties that existed between him and his parish. In other words, he is best known for what he wasn't. Now, what does Trinity Church Newark have to do with Sussex County, and what does Ogden being denied consecration as bishop have to do with the American Revolution? First, to set the record straight, it is true Ogden was denied consecration and never actually became bishop, which would have made him the first bishop of any denomination in New Jersey, and in particular the first bishop of the Episcopal Church in the state following its separation from the Church of England. It was still the Church of England when Ogden was ordained and began his career as the first rector of Christ Church in Newton. After all, when the parish was founded in 1769, Newton was still part of the English colonies, and its one fully functioning church was very much part of the English church when it was chartered in 1773, indeed in the name of King George III. But it was only 3 years later that the revolution fully ignited, drastically changing life in America, which brings us to Uzal Ogden and the American Revolution. Before we get to what Ogden did and didn't do, let's flesh him out a little. Uzal Ogden Jr. was born in Newark in 1744 to a well-to-do family. His father, Uzal Sr., was one of the founders of Trinity Church Newark, now Trinity Cathedral, and at one time or another, a Newark merchant, Essex County judge, and Essex County sheriff. He was also a principal in the development of iron mining in Ringwood, New Jersey. The younger Uzal, our Uzal, had little formal education, but broad and excellent religious training under the guidance of the Reverend Thomas Chandler, rector of St. John's Church, Elizabeth, the motivating force behind establishing a parish in Sussex County in 1769. With Chandler's strong encouragement, Ogden sought holy orders. There was no bishop of the Church of England in the colonies, so this meant he had to endure a transatlantic voyage in a sailing ship, not much larger than a lifeboat of a modern cruise ship, some 12 weeks round trip tossing about at sea in order to receive ordination at the hands of the Right Reverend Richard Terrick, the Lord Bishop of London, who was officially the prelate with jurisdiction over the British colonies. Back home, Ogden officially became rector of Christ Church, Newton, a position he held until 1788. Now, Ogden was known as a strong and commanding preacher. He was considered an impressive presence in the pulpit, not least of all by virtue of being 6 feet tall, a half-foot taller than the average man of his day. He was known for lengthy sermons that occasionally went on for as much as 2 hours. Ogden left Newton to become an assistant at Trinity Church, New York, then is now one of the most prestigious parishes in the country. He then accepted a call by Trinity Newark to become the second rector of Trinity Church in Newark, the parish his father helped to found. Although his tenure there was often unsettled toward the end, it was also a productive time of life for Ogden. He was a delegate to the General Conventions of the Episcopal Church from 1785 to 1804, and notably in 1798, he received an honorary doctorate from what is now Princeton University, with the result that from then on, his name was usually styled the Reverend Dr. Uzal Ogden, which he seemed to take a lot of delight in. Ogden published a number of books and tracts, some while Rector of Christ Church, Newton, most while Rector of Trinity Church, Newark. Church historian Nelson Burr considered him the leading writer of religious tracts and pamphlets in America in his time. Most books were stretched out sermons, but some bordered on the political. For example, Antidote to Deism, The Deist Unmasked, or An Ample Refutation of All the Objections of Thomas Paine. Published in Newark in 1795, a refutation of Paine's deism expressed in the latter's Age of Reason. George Washington is known to have had a copy in his personal library, possibly given to him by Ogden himself. A deist, by contemporary definition, was someone who was essentially opposed to the Christian faith, but wanted to be known by a more honorable name than atheist. These various books, along with preaching appearances and personal contacts, helped make Ogden arguably the best known Episcopal churchman in New Jersey. So when the Diocese of New Jersey in 1798 set about to elect its first bishop, Ogden was the runaway favorite of three candidates and was elected bishop almost unanimously. But under the procedures of the newly established Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States, the duly elected bishop of a diocese did not assume office until approved by the National Church's next General Convention, which in this case would have been later in 1798 in Philadelphia. This too seemed like a sure thing, except that Philadelphia was hit by an epidemic of yellow fever and the convention was postponed. It was a fatal delay. Nasty stories started circulating, apparently generated by or on behalf of the other candidates, that Ogden wasn't up to the job intellectually, that he wasn't Episcopal enough, that he was too cozy with the Methodists, and that the New Jersey Convention made procedural errors in its election. The General Convention, swayed by the bad-mouthing and focused on creating a new Episcopal Church as pure in doctrine as that from which it had separated, conveniently dulled its qualms by denying Ogden consecration. Well, not exactly. They let him twist in the wind, postponing a final vote and telling the New Jersey delegation to go back and think it over, not too subtly, hoping New Jersey would find a different candidate. The net result was that the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey did not have its first bishop until 1815. Now, as for Ogden and the American Revolution, when Ogden began his career in Newton, 1770s, the colonies and the mother company were still at peace. But no sooner had he settled down as the pastoral president of the Church of England in Sussex County, indeed all of northwest New Jersey, that he found the English Church in America increasingly wrenched by the rising tide of independence. Think of what a dilemma it posed for Ogden and all the other priests of the Church of England. To be a faithful servant to his call, an Anglican priest quickly found himself the object of mistrust among the patriots. The Book of Common Prayer, the mandatory form of worship throughout the Anglican world, made specific a requirement that every minister lead his congregation in pledging to, quote, faithfully serve, honor, and humbly obey the King as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. to humbly obey the same king who was becoming more and more the object of rebellion, the same king whose statue in New York was recently overturned by angry patriots to symbolize the fall of majesty. The turbulence that was affecting society as a whole affected ministers of the Church of England in a unique and heartbreaking way, polarizing some into Tories, some into patriots, but leaving many in between, and many of these retreating to the security of living in England. So precarious were the times that preachers in America ascended the pulpit with pistols under their gowns for their protection, lest the message fall on the wrong ears. Ogden is believed to be one of only 5 Anglican priests who remained in New Jersey during the war. Since Ogden remained in America and continued to file regular written reports with the Home Office, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in London, or SPG as we refer to it here, has left us a unique account of Sussex County during the Revolution. But before we look at this, there's the question: was Uzal Ogden really a patriot or really a Tory? First, he seems to have managed chameleon-like to be both, to span the spectrum of volatile opinion with great dexterity. For his patriot bona fides, he could point to that fulcrum of patriot opinion, the Sussex County Committee of Correspondence. Many of them were his friends and some of them parishioners. At least 4 were founders of Christ Church, and as far as we know, still on cordial terms with Ogden. Thomas Anderson, vestryman; Edward Dunlop, vestryman; Nathaniel Pettit, warden; and Archibald Stewart, warden. Some of the other appointees may have been parishioners, but not officers of Christ Church. Stewart was also sheriff, and Anderson came to distinguish himself during the war as Deputy Assistant Quartermaster General of the Continental Army. The Anderson House is on Main Street in Newton. It's part of Christ Church, and it basically serves as the parish office. But it's still there. You can see it very easily walking up Main Street from the square. Pettit was a former judge of the Court of Common Pleas. As far as we know, these clear-cut patriots remained upstanding members of Christ Church during the war. So Ogden, Tory or patriot? Potentially standing all this friendship on end is the greatest mystery of Ogden's life. Late in 1776, he disappeared from the parish and reappeared in that hotbed of Toryism, New York, for at least a month, with no plausible explanation. And the only way we know that is that he duly filed a report on his absence with the SPG, his home office in London. So, a Tory after all. Or so. Ogden left Newton December 6, 1776, and what was so far the height of discouragement for the patriot cause. Quote, strong apprehensions are entertained that the British will soon have it in their power to vanquish the whole of the remains of the Continental Army, lamented one American officer. Miraculous escape from Long Island in late summer was turning into a full-scale retreat through New Jersey, to Hackensack, to Newark, Ogden's old hometown, and clear across the Midlands of New Jersey, New Brunswick, Princeton, Trenton, finally into Pennsylvania. With the ruthlessness of winter setting in, the Continental Army totaled not more than 3,500 men, most of them in ragged coats and wretched shoes, or none at all, and only a threadbare blanket, or none at all, for protection against the numbing bitter cold of tentless nights. In England, the 13th of December, 1776, a Friday, was declared a national day of fasting and prayer, for supplication in particular, that His Majesty's deluded colonists might see the error of their ways. Clergy throughout the land were provided with a supplement to the Book of Common Prayer, with changes in the offices of Holy Communion, morning prayer, and evening prayer, as celebrated on that day. scrupulously to the point, was the shrewd designation of the Episcopal for this fasting and prayer day. It was from the first epistle of Peter, which includes these lines very cunningly chosen. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of the man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors, as unto them that are sent for him, for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Original prayers also were drafted to reinforce the message of the day. Thus, in the prayer for our enemies, the British subjects pray, give grace, we beseech thee, to our unhappy fellow subjects in America, that seeing and confessing the error of their ways, that they may again return to their duty, make themselves worthy of thy pardon and forgiveness. Now, on that first Friday of December, this first year of independence, a week before the day of prayer in England, that was the day that Ogden left Christ Church in Newton for what he called refuge in New York. As recorded by the SBG, Ogden tells the society that on the 6th of December, he had been obliged to leave his mission and family and take refuge in New York, from whence he is, however, returned to his mission as of January 4, 1777. And indeed, Ogden is frequently commended in the Society's reports for his faithful and efficient work. But in fact, Ogden had not returned to his mission by January 4th. He remained in New York City at least most of January. That is his own disclosure in a letter to the SPG dated New York, January 24, 1777, written to his usual SPG correspondent at the time, the Reverend Dr. Richard Hind of St. Anne's, Westminster. The discrepancy in the date of Ogden's return to Newton may owe to the earlier account having been received by a different official at the SPG, who simply assumed Ogden was back in Newton. This was Ogden's letter to Dr. Hind, and all we have Dr. Hind's, in Ogden's own words, about his mysterious disappearance. Quote, my last letter to you was the 24th October, since which, sir, on the 6th of December, 1776, I have, on account of the political confusions of the country, been obliged to leave my mission and my family, and have taken refuge in this city. My anxiety on account of my mission and family is great, and for its relief, I humbly and patiently rely on the goodness of divine providence. Ogden's absence from his parish was no secret, at least in Tory circles, as is evident from a particularly poignant account of the state of affairs in America in general, and the Anglican Church in particular. Writing in May 1777, a Tory cleric, the Reverend Samuel Cook, talked about the, quote, dreadful state to which this country has arrived, as it renders any approach to my mission impractical and renders me unfit for anything, unless it is to ruminate on the distress of this once happy country. Cook was aware of Ogden's situation, further writing, quote, Mr. Ogden Ierley was compelled to go in haste from Sussex, where he is at present. I did not learn. Why did Ogden go to New York? Why did he apparently leave behind his family? He was married early that year of 1776, and the couple had their first child late in 1776, seemingly about the time of Ogden's taking refuge in New York. The Ogdens made their home in a relatively spacious and quite comfortable stone parsonage, built only a few years earlier on a hill overlooking the village of Newton, roughly half a mile or a 15-minute walk from the county courthouse, where services were frequently held. The house is still there, arguably the oldest in Newton. Certainly, some of the families who were members of the parish lived within that area, and given the spirit of supportiveness that was characteristic of the frontier, some of the wives undoubtedly attended to Mrs. Ogden, so she would not have been left alone. Menfolk surely would have pitched in to do whatever else needed doing. Thus, Ogden surely knew that leaving his family certainly did not mean abandoning them. But there are no church records documenting his intention to be away from the parish, though he may well have put it in writing, a long-lost document. Or, more likely, he may simply have made it known his plans verbally to one of the wardens. But why New York? And by New York, did he mean city as opposed to somewhere in New York State? A reference to New York at this time almost certainly meant the city. And having grown up in Newark, he would have had at least a passing familiarity with the city, then meaning lower Manhattan, which was 10 miles from Newark by horse and ferry, and with Trinity Church already a dominating presence in both the religious and civic life of New York. It was Trinity 8 years hence that would call Ogden from his wilderness sanctuary and make him an assistant minister. An officially authorized history of Trinity Church gives us only a clue as to the Ogden mystery, commenting that, quote, like the other clergy in those days, he suffered from the war, unquote. Suffered in what way? Perhaps there were threats against him by Tory activists, angry that Ogden was not Tory enough, or from patriot activists, angry that he was not patriot enough. Remember, he had a skill, chameleon-like, to be both, to span the spectrum of volatile opinion with great dexterity. As for Trinity Church, if that was Ogden's destination, it would have been a naive choice. Could it be he was not aware that it had burned to the ground just a few months before? All the tumult that marked the year 1776 had made Trinity and its conspicuously Anglican clergy the brunt of patriot enmity. Trinity's acting rector, the Reverend Charles Inglis, who had taken over for the church's ailing rector, Samuel Archbody, wrote of this situation, quote, the clergy, amidst this scene of tumult and disorder, went on steadily with their duty, in their sermons confining themselves to the doctrine of the gospel without touching on politics, using their influence to allay our hearts, cherish a spirit of loyalty among their people. Their conduct, however, harmless, gave great offense to our flaming patriots who laid it down as a maximum that those who were not for them were against them. Clergy were everywhere threatened, sometimes treated with brutal violence. Inglis and other Anglican ministers ignored the threats, but the situation became more and more intense. Finally, in late spring of 1776, armed patriots marched into Trinity Church during a service, threatened to shoot if Inglis said the prescribed prayers for the king, but then backed down. Elsewhere, mob violence ruled. According to one contemporary report, quote, citizens of the city of New York gathered together, a number of themselves, and went about rounding up all those supposed to be Tories, stripped a number of them naked, and then carried about the streets on a rail. The real turning point came in the early summer of 1776, when a fleet of more than 100 British ships arrived off New York Harbor like a swarm of locusts, escaped from a bottomless pit. There could be no doubt the city was about to become the next objective of British strategy. Nor was there any doubt of colonial resistance. Following the reading of the Declaration of Independence to Continental Army troops on orders of General Washington, patriot partisans issued their own celebration of independence by toppling a statue of George III astride his horse that reigned over Bowling Green since 1770. It was the first equestrian statue ever made of the king, and now lay in pieces. this, quote, ominous fall of leaden majesty, so the Patriot New York Journal, left the monarch prostrate in the dirt, the just desert of an ungrateful time. Such bravado, however, was followed by the departure of patriots from the city as more and more the prospect of British invasion became imminent. British arrived on Sunday, September 15, 1776, and took over the city. Trinity Church, faithfully Anglican, remained open for a week. Following Saturday came what history knows as the Great Fire of 1776. It left a fourth of the city in ashes, including Trinity Church. Now the highest structure in the city, the 140-foot tall steeple, Trinity turned into what one observer said was a vast pyramid of fire, exhibiting a grand and awful spectacle. Arson on the part of fleeing patriots was immediately suspected but never proved. Regardless, the strong wind blowing from the harbor, coupled with a long dry spell that had turned New York to tinder, created a catastrophe that left block after block of smoldering rubble. The loss in land holdings of Trinity Church alone was estimated at £30,000. Mercifully, St. Paul's Chapel, part of Trinity Parish, was spared and substituted for the mother church until rebuilding was completed. This then was New York of December 1776, fully in British hands. Why on earth would a parish priest from out in the country want to venture there? It was really for the purpose of refuge. Ogden seemed to affect a strange place, even of pretending loyalty to the crown. Meanwhile, Sussex County was then and remained relatively untouched by war. As close as it was to the scene of several battles, not to mention General Washington's two winter-long encampments in nearby Bardstown. The wilds of northwestern New Jersey nevertheless escaped the tumult that befell other parts of the state. The cruelest threat was from Native Americans acting in collusion with British forces in the upper Delaware Valley, including Sussex County. So the 19th century history writer, this area that suffered severely from Indian hostilities during the French War, was not less exposed during the War of Revolution to the merciless sway of the tomahawk and scalping knife. The same savage foes lurked upon the frontiers, ever ready to renew their bloody work at the instigation of British allies. In 1777, a party of savages slaughtered 2 or 3 families north of the Neversink River, and then crossed into Montague, where they tomahawked a family named Jobs and next attacked the dwelling of Captain Abraham Schuyler, who, with the assistance of 3 or 4 Negro servants, by his own indomitable resistance, compelled them to retire. In a few days, they returned and captured Mr. Patterson and his 2 small boys. Nonetheless, the county seat of Newton was sufficiently settled to make such atrocities a far greater probability elsewhere. And other than the courthouse and jail, the Christ Church parsonage was probably the most formidable structure in town, if not the county. Ogden would seem to have had refuge there. The reason for Ogden's taking refuge in New York has never been explained. He could have been playing Tories against patriots, but that kind of scheming wasn't Ogden's nature. What we do know is that he seems to have had an almost father-son relationship with the SPG that transcended political realities, and that continued until after the war, when the society no longer had authority in America. It may be that in going to New York, he felt he could demonstrate his religious loyalty to the Church of England, even while back at home, he was demonstrating his political loyalty to the patriot cause. There appears to have been no event or circumstances at Newton that compelled him to leave, nor any circumstance in New York that drew him. Ogden tells us only that what he told the SPG in his communication was the fact that in any event, as far as we know, Mrs. Ogden and her child remained safe. Ogden himself returned safely to his family and carried on as rector. They had a second child, Samuel, in 1779, and eventually 4 more. Unlike so many Church of England parishes in America, after the declaring of independence, life at Christ Church went on much as it had before. Indeed, the parish seemed to thrive during the Revolutionary War. As Ogden reported to the SPG in October 1776, quote, "Since the 25th of October 1775, I have married a number of couples, buried 33 corpses, baptized 13 white and black adults, 62 white and 2 black children, and have had an addition of 9 eunuchs." But independence did confront Ogden with the same dilemma other Church of England prelates in America had to face: how to pray for the king without actually praying for the king. Ogden resolved that in his own way, and then almost 4 months after the Declaration of Independence, felt constrained to confide his solution to Dr. Hind of the SPG. Almost like a naughty boy who took the cookies and shouldn't be punished by virtue of preemptively confessing, he admitted that he had to stop using the liturgy essentially for political reason, and was that all right? Explained Ogden, quote, "After the Declaration of Independence, I thought I could not, consistent with my obligations, use part of the liturgy and omit the rest. I have therefore omitted the whole. I should be exceeding glad to know the pleasure of the society with respect to my future conduct in this particular." It seems clear that he felt a bond with the SPG and Dr. Hind in particular, rooted in a faith that transcended the politics of independence. Assuming he was really a patriot at heart, it is worth noting that the break from the mother country did not, for him, mean a break in his personal connection to the mother church, or perhaps more meaningful to Ogden, a break with the secretary of the SPG, who seems to have become his father in God, a role once filled in Ogden's life by the loyalist Thomas Chandler, who tutored Ogden for the priesthood. Ogden continued making reports to the SPG on roughly an annual basis through 1782, after the Revolutionary War had ended. Ogden also continued writing and publishing sermons and to promote them as published books, not unlike an ambitious author of modern times. Ogden publicized his published works through newspapers. Going right to the top was perhaps more to his liking in a letter dated Newtown, Sussex County, New Jersey, 16 July 1779. Right in the middle of the war, Ogden wrote to George Washington, quote, "May it please your Excellency, although I have not the honor to be personally acquainted with the Commander-in-Chief of the armies of the United States, I am no stranger to the general fame of his virtues. This alone emboldens me to take the liberty of closing a sermon, just published, for the promotion of practical religion at this period of its too unhappy declension. If it means the den of war and scenes of business, His Excellency shall find a leisure moment to pursue it, and the pursuit afford any satisfaction, give its author a very sensible pleasure. That His Excellency may long wear the wreath of laurel woven by the hand of America, and in due time be invested with the palm of victory, the crown of glory, which fade not away, is my humble and ardent prayer, Uzal Ogden." In the remarkably short time of 2.5 weeks for a letter going by horseback, which would be remarkable even today writing to a government official, there was a reply in the mail to Ogden, and even if somewhat perfunctory, must have given this 35-year-old priest considerable satisfaction, wrote fellow Episcopalian George Washington on August 5th from West Point, New York, quote, "I have received and with pleasure read the sermon you were so obliging as to send me. I thank you for this proof of your attention. Thank you also for the favorable sentiments you have given me and expressed to me. But in a more special manner, I thank you for the good wishes and prayers you offer in my behalf. Your most obedient and humble servant, George Washington." These letters further established that that Ogden remained in Newton during the war years, one of only a few Anglican priests who remained in New Jersey during the war. And since he continued to correspond regularly with London, Ogden provides us with otherwise inaccessible insight into what life was like in Sussex County during the American Revolution. That Christ Church not only remained open, but actually flourished during the war is apparent from another report Ogden sent to the SPG, this one on February 24, 1779. Quote, "From October 15, 1776 to May 8, 1778, I have baptized 6 adults, 116 children, and 1 black adult, buried 8 and married 12 couples. This account I have transmitted. 4, since which I have baptized 2 white and 3 black adults, 51 white children, and 1 black infant, buried 4, married 5 couples." This was the activity at Christ Church, Newton, when Anglican churches elsewhere in New Jersey had closed their doors. In a report written in 1782, 2 years before leaving Newton, and a year after the decisive Battle of Yorktown, Ogden said that for the period covering the war years generally, he had conducted 64 marriages, 24 burials, 731 baptisms, including 31 black infants and 23 black adults. He said he believed, quote, "The good effects of my administrations appear visibly in the lives and conversations of many persons, and I am humbly confident, therefore, that the seed of the divine word is not untrue." At the same time, Ogden might also be found tending to the pastoral needs of those outside his own flock, as in this 1780 account written about the time that Ogden's father died. Quote, quoting from the New Jersey Journal, "We are informed that at Newtown, Sussex, on May 6, John McCoy and Robert Maxwell, deserters from the Continental Army, were convicted of burglary. The Friday ensuing, McCoy was executed and the other given a postponement until the 9th of June next. As during their imprisonment, they were often visited by the Reverend Mr. Ogden, who gained their confidence and esteem as they were convinced that a confession of guilt might, even to their temporal advantage, and would not operate against any clemency they might expect, and that silence would be construed as obstinacy. As in a discourse Mr. Ogden delivered on the occasion, in his address to them, among other things, he, in the most affecting manner, showed the awful consequence of departing this life in a state of impenitence, or with guilt in their lips. Great numbers of the spectators were inclined to entertain very favorable sentiments of their innocence. Was he, or wasn't he, Tory or patriot? Far closer in time than we stand today was this judgment by the Evangelical Anglican Journal, The Churchman. Quote, "In New Jersey, we must not forget that Uzal Ogden, New Jersey's first bishop-elect, was prominent on the patriot side. Pretty unequivocal. Furthermore, there was the honorary doctorate Ogden received in 1798 from the future Princeton University. College in Princeton during the Revolution was considered, quote, a seminary of sedition against the crown and its graduates overwhelmingly patriot. hardly an institution that would commend Tory. Perhaps most significant of all was Ogden's letter of July 1779 to General Washington, which could have been intercepted by the British, entreating that His Excellency may long wear the wreath of laurel woven by the hand of America, and in due time be invested with the palm of victory and crown of glory. Tory or patriot, ultimately one is left with the conclusion that he was both, that he was torn between supporting the patriot cause while also being faithful to the Church of England. But whatever the case, his faithfulness to the Church of England is manifested in his reports to the SPG right through the Revolutionary War, provide us today with insight into the home that we would not otherwise have. A church in Newton not only surviving, but thriving during the war and reaching out beyond its own traditional membership to embrace Blacks in greater number than we might otherwise even thought to have lived in Sussex County. Thank you. That's your turn. If any of you have any remarks you'd like to make, or